So one of the things that we see in the school video that's related to this section, as well as to the chapters in Tozer, is the influence of religion on education, as well as on just national culture, and what people are envisioning when they say, this is what it means to be an American. So if we look at early school curriculum, we can see that a lot of the texts are explicitly religious. So, for example, we see characters from the Bible. We see the Lord's Prayer utilized as just a taken for granted part of the lesson. We see moral tales such as don't be lazy, don't lay around in bed all day. And all of these are part of the curriculum for students. Webster is the first person who put together a more coherent textbook that was adopted in a widespread manner. Webster is also the person who decided that we were going to have a separate version of English language from Britain, that there was going to be an American version. So he's the reason why we don't spell color with a U. He's the reason why we pronounce some things differently. He's the person who got that all started. So to just kind of get an idea of Noah Webster's worldview, I put together some quotes here. So he's saying, it may be true that all men cannot be legislators, but the more generally knowledge is diffused among the substantial yeomanry, the more perfect will be the laws of a republican state. So there's a few different classical liberal ideologies embedded in this statement. The first is that hierarchical view of natural law. In the first statement, it may be true that all men cannot be legislators. So what he's saying is we're ranking and sorting ability. Some people are capable of this, other people are not. The other thing he's invoking is republican virtue, where very clearly whenever you see yeomanry, you should just think republican virtue. So what he's saying in here is that the more we make available information to the broader citizenry, the more they can uphold the law. So he's saying faith and reason, they need to have information, and republican virtue, that we're going to teach them to think in certain ways, to respect the law, and to defer to the common good. Another quote by Webster that helps illustrate his connection to classical liberalism is this one. But every child in America should be acquainted with his own country. He should read books that furnish him with ideas that will be useful to him in life and practice. As soon as he opens his lips, he should rehearse the history of his own country. He should lisp the praise of liberty and of those illustrious heroes and statesmen who have wrought a revolution in her favor. So this is a very clear example of early nationalism, of using schools as a way to socialize children into an American identity, and using that in a very heavy-handed way, where you're less interested in accuracy than you are in creating the heroes and myths that will get people to emotionally invest in patriotism. Benjamin Rush is another person in the same time period who thought in ways that were very similar to Noah Webster. So he's also saying we basically need to overtly socialize people into an American identity, and we are going to choose what that means. We will choose what it means to be American. So he's saying the principle of patriotism stands in need of the reinforcement of prejudice, and it is well known that our strongest prejudices in favor of our country are formed in the first 1 in 20 years of our lives. And so what he's saying is basically take kids, get them young, teach them these heroes and holidays, these myths, get them emotionally invested, and that's going to stick with them later in life. And then we'll have them thinking in ways that are supporting the patriotism that we would like. He's also saying, another quote here, our schools of learning, by producing one general and uniform system of education, will render the mass of the people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. So again, he's identifying homogeneity with being American, and that's as desirable and actually a crucial part of survival for the country. In other words, he's identifying diversity or heterogeneity as a threat to national survival. And that becomes extremely important because this is an ongoing tension throughout our country, today included, where people identify diversity of language, diversity of race, of culture, as things that tear the country apart, not just as a natural, normal part of the United States that have always been here. Now, Jefferson differs from Rush and Webster in his perspective, in the sense that he has a lot more faith in reason. So if you remember at the beginning of the PowerPoint, we talked about this tension between freedom and order. Rush and Webster are both saying, we want order. We want to socialize people to think a certain way. It's going to create stability. They're going to agree to be American in the way we want them to. They're going to maintain the status quo. Everything's going to settle down. What Jefferson is saying is freedom. Freedom to use your intellect, freedom to make good choices. And basically what he's saying is, I trust you. If you are an intelligent person, if you have access to this information, I trust you to choose something that will support the public good. Part of the problem with this idea, however, is he's kind of assuming a homogeneity of interests or experiences that would lead people to all choose the way that he would choose, which isn't necessarily the case. But a kind of takeaway statement that gives us an idea of how Jefferson is thinking is this one. Whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. Okay. Another illustrating quote is, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. So these two quotes illustrate very clearly that there's a big difference between Thomas Jefferson and other thinkers of this time. Jefferson is very much on the side of a faith in reason and freedom. Okay. Now, Jefferson also had some contradictions because when it came down to actually how he designed what he thought of as a good plan for public schools, his practice differed from his theory. In the earlier quotations, he's saying, I believe everyone can learn, everyone's smart, everyone can self-govern. But his plan here is very hierarchical. It's basically mirroring the inequality in society that's already there. It's very raced, it's very gendered, it's very classed. However, at the same time, this is actually a somewhat progressive plan for the time period, in the sense that he's not saying that only people who have been born into a particular position are capable of making decisions for others. What he's saying is that some people actually have talent or intellect who are poor, which at this time period is a significant difference. And what he's saying is that this is what we need. We need to cultivate leadership from everywhere if we're going to survive as a democracy. We can't just rely on this old hereditary aristocracy. So this was a never implemented plan, but Jefferson's plan was to create this natural aristocracy, this future leadership. And this is pretty much limited to white males. There were 3 years of schooling available for white females, but this completely excluded African Americans, indigenous people, pretty much anyone who wasn't white. And it was a tiered system where the white boys and girls all start out for 3 years kind of together. Then the girls stop going. Then we see a series of examinations and tests, and then some of the boys get weeded out. The wealthy boys can continue either way because they can keep paying for it. But for some of those low-income boys who can't otherwise pay, they'll get some scholarships based on their test performance. And that'll just keep happening through different tiers of education until you end up with this tiny elite or natural aristocracy. So here's an illustration of basically how that works. Now, one of the things you can see is that this is, like we said, a very tiered program. This is not necessarily democratic, even though it appears democratic, because people theoretically, through their own effort, could move forward. However, when we understand that upper income boys can move forward no matter what, and that it's really only on people who are already severely disadvantaged that they have to earn it, and that there are whole populations of people who don't even have a chance to start at this bottom point, then we realize that this is an unequal structure, even though it appears very equal and open because of this idea that you can compete or earn a higher place. Okay. So just to kind of conclude and draw everything together, it's good to just ask some questions about What do people mean at this time period when they say us as Americans, when they say we the people? Who's included in that framework? That becomes extremely important, because one of the things we need to remember as we move through the course is that the way schools kind of started out at this time period, they've never tremendously changed. There have been some shifts in organization, there have been some shifts in adding curriculum, adding other functions to the school, who pays for it. But in terms of the culture of schooling, this taken for granted idea of what we're socializing students into, that hasn't necessarily changed a lot, especially when you talk about Americanization. This idea that English is the right way to go, that Protestant ethics are just ethics, that whiteness is a taken for granted norm. These are things that haven't really gone away. So it's important to understand the roots of that in this early time period. The other thing is just to really understand the political nature of public schooling. That, for example, all of these plans and ideas were developed by elites for people who were subordinated. There wasn't necessarily shared decision-making, shared planning, the right to say no on the part of a lot of lower-income people. So this is an example of, natural law, where people who basically deemed themselves more capable to decide for others then said that, well, it's natural that we should be in authority. We have the right to make these choices. But what that does is it creates a lot of power in terms of description, narrative, and decision making. It's power in description and narrative because it's people who are benefiting from this inequality who are articulating what the causes of this inequality are. In that situation, it's very unlikely that they will look to themselves and say, this is a raw power play, that's why we deserve to be here. It's much more likely that they will say, well, you didn't work hard, you don't care, you drink a beer on Friday when you come home from work, you're not virtuous, that's why you don't have what we have. So it's just important to understand that that power of defining resides with the people who are at the top of that unequal structure. Okay. And then the last questions and considerations are around access and also outcomes in a democratic society. Especially when we get into the discussion of the common schools entering into the early 1800s, one of the things we see more strongly is that relationship between economic changes and what's happening in the schools. In other words, schools start to really more overtly socialize people for futures as workers and try to stabilize labor tensions on the part of corporations. But if we're talking from a purely democratic standpoint, not a capitalist standpoint, we should have systems that are guaranteeing equal outcomes, not just equal access. In other words, is it really democratic to just allow people to walk through the same door and say, all right, everybody had their chance, that means that you're equal and free? Or in a democratic society, is it better to make sure that everyone has similar, reasonably similar outcomes in terms of everybody can read, everyone knows how to do math, everyone's prepared for a reasonable trade, and so forth? So that becomes a big tension during this time period, and honestly one that's still with us today. So in general, the key takeaway points for this early time period are the tension between freedom and order, and also the way in which there are huge inequalities socially, politically, economically, that are quite often explained away or naturalized through the use of classical liberalism. All right, thank you very much.